have a chat about it. It's quite informal. Really, the presentation I'm going to give to you tonight was developed by one of our other pilots, Luke and I, and we sort of try to personalise it for each of the clubs. But really what it's going to just show is a bit of an overview on what we do on the water as far as pilotage and bringing large ships in and out of Sydney Harbour goes. And then also just some points on as far as traffic management goes and keeping yourself safe on the water. So yeah, any questions, see out. And I'm just going to move over this side of the room so that I can press the button and keep arrowing through. So there's a picture of the pilot boat. Most of you will be aware of that sort of vessel moving around the harbour. They're fairly common throughout all ports in the world, this type of vessel. You can see we've got large fendering on the sides because we actually do a transfer at sea underway, and from that yellow area there, that's where the pilot transfers across, so that's where I go out to get onto the ship. In New South Wales, the pilotage is run by the Port Authority of New South Wales, who's my employer. So they operate from Port Kembla, from Sydney, Botany and from Newcastle. And they also do the satellite ports of Eden and Yamba as well. So all up in New South Wales, we've got 60 marine pilots. For Sydney and Botany, we share the roles, so each pilot who's licensed for Botany becomes licensed for Sydney Harbour and vice versa. And we have 20 pilots here for Botany and Sydney. So we work under the Harbour Master, Myron Fernandez, in Sydney, and we've also got a Deputy Harbour Master who helps us out as well. So basically, those two gentlemen, Myron and Nick, are in charge of all commercial shipping traffic in and out of Sydney Harbour, and also for the licensing of all of the pilots that come through and train under the auspices of the Port Authority of New South Wales. It's going to show a quick video now. This is just one that one of my colleagues took of us boarding a vessel. It's sped up, it's probably 3 or 4 times speed, but it just gives you an idea of what happens when we board. It works. So you see we're just coming along. We'll typically do this transfer at 8 to 10 knots. There's a rope ladder there that we're going to climb up. We try to send the gear that we're taking on board up by bag, and we jump on the ladder and start climbing. The maximum climb we're allowed to do without having the ship's gangway come down and join that ladder is 9 metres, so we can do actually 9 metres of a rope ladder climb. And that one you can see there is probably around 7 metres. And once we board the ship, first time we get to interact with the crew on board, we've just got a trainee pilot who's getting on this job as well. You can see the trainee moving up now. So this is an oil tanker that we're getting on board at the moment, and then we generally try and move pretty quickly from there up to the bridge of the ship to make sure they're pointing in the right direction prior to entering the port. Obviously this is done in COVID, that's why everyone's got the face masks on, and we're still actually wearing face masks when we go out on the ships at the moment, just because of the risk of possible transmission. So this ship would be an oil tanker that was due for Gore Bay up the harbour. Usually you get around 2 of those per week still coming in to Sydney Harbour, and they vary in size from the biggest size we do is 270 metres long, which would be about 130,000 tonnes, down to the smallest ones that are 180 or so metres long, and they're about 40,000 tonnes. So yeah, that's generally the first reading we get of the ship's crew, and you can see there the ship's just lining up for entry into port. The impetus for these talks is actually quite interesting. As laughable as that is, this caused a near fatal incident with some junior sailors on Sydney Harbour. Unfortunately, the reality is that we have increased cruise traffic in Sydney, and on this particular day, the Pacific Explorer, which is a regular ship on the east coast of Australia, a P&O ship, she went out at her scheduled time. 2 hours later, somebody fell ill. They came back unscheduled to drop that person back off in Sydney. They then went out, and following the delay because of coming back in for a medevac, there ended up being some fracas on board, and somebody had to queue up for a toilet apparently, and that caused a fight which involved about 150 people. So then they had to once again unscheduled bring the ship back in to get police on board and get these people off.
Was there alcohol involved?
May have been. I believe the all-inclusive drinks package is a bit of a killer on these things. When the ship was coming back in, there were junior sailors sailing out of Vaucluse on some Flying 11s, and one of the Flying 11s capsized right in front of the ship off the Sound Pigs. So obviously they were in a confined part of the channel. The ship was doing around 10 knots speed, so it couldn't stop in a hurry. And fortunately, when the boat was upside down, the children grabbed onto the centreboard and just bounced down the side of the vessel. So following that, we started trying to increase the presence of people moving around to the sailing clubs to give this explanation on traffic throughout the harbour. But as I was saying to a few people over dinner, I think for the amount of sailing traffic and recreational traffic on Sydney Harbour we have, it's actually fantastic how few incidents we have. They really are few and far between, so I congratulate everyone for doing the right thing. It is actually quite rare to have an incident. I showed a video footage to a few people earlier, a few weeks ago. I had one myself, but in reality it's probably maybe a dozen times a year we have problems, which is actually pretty good considering we have around 3,000 ships coming in and out of the harbour.
Yeah. The person that capsized in front of it, did they go in between the pilot and the ship?
So the pilot boat we had out doing the escort in front, and that's a good question. Yeah, so what actually happened was that the children weren't aware that that was actually a problem, being young, and so they just kept sailing along in front, and then I suspect when they've seen the ship bearing down on top of them, they probably panicked, and that's what's caused the capsize. So the pilot boat did circle back, and they actually couldn't get close enough to them to grab the children off the boat. And one of the guys on the pilot boat just got on the loudhailer and said to the kids, just hang on to your boat and we'll stay afloat, and they bounced down the side of the vessel. So this is the sort of thing that I guess crops up, and often someone mentioned over dinner we look at the shipping schedule, and I'll show you that shortly. This is where you can get things that don't fall inside the shipping schedule, so sometimes we have a few things that are unplanned occur. This one here is actually the shipping fairways, or gazetted shipping fairways for Sydney Harbour. So a lot of people don't realise that anywhere you can see blue there, we can actually take a commercial ship. It pretty much is the whole harbour, other than you guys up here. And I won't mention some of the work I've done that's top secret that may involve coming up here on certain vessels as well, but maybe later on you can ask me about that off the record. So you can see there we've got the main entrance to the port, up around the sea buoy. We've got the east and the west channels around the Sound Pigs Reef. There's actually a nominated anchorage up in Watson's Bay, and then we also occasionally take ships over to Charter Bay to the Navy berth. We can come right down to a nominated anchorage here off Point Piper, an anchorage off Athol Bay, right up to the tanker berths in Gore Cove and down into White Bay. So we no longer take anything up to Crocodile Island, that's all stopped. So pretty much the line between Longnose Point there is where we'll cease commercial shipping. This one shows the standardised tracks that we generally take coming in and out of Sydney Harbour. I just actually had a look on my cheap Navionics app on the iPhone before I came to you guys today to see if they've put this shipping fairway in. And most of you on your plotters should see this now coming up. So that's actually being put in as a gazetted shipping fairway, so it does give everyone an indication of where ships could go. But essentially, where you can see the solid red line, that's commonly where we'll be taking large commercial traffic. So we generally don't use the East Channel if we can avoid it, because as you know, a lot of people fish in there and it's quite busy with recreational traffic, and it's also only suitable for smaller ships. So we try to avoid that if we can, but occasionally we will have to use it. Most of the time we're straight down the West Channel. For the most part, we observe the safe watermark inbound to the north, outbound to the south, and similarly for Port Denison we do the same thing, inbound to the north and outbound to the south. There are times when that does get altered. The largest cruise ships we do, of course, we can't pass under the harbour bridge, so we stop short at Circular Quay. Smaller cruise ships can come around the corner to White Bay number 5 over here at Balmain, and we have a cement berth up this end of the harbour, and we have some general purpose berths here and here as well. Gore Cove, where we take the tankers, there's 2 berths up there. Generally the smaller berth is just designated for the fuel barge, the bunker barge that runs around the harbour refuelling cruise ships, and the second berth is for the large tankers that we have. I mentioned this earlier, so some of you will be aware of this daily vessel movements sheet, and I expect the race committee probably have a good look at this prior to each of the courses that they set. We'll go through that a little bit later on, but ultimately on the Port Authority website, if you just go to Port Authority New South Wales or just put in Sydney Harbour vessel movements, this will come up and it gives you a bit of a clue as to what's happening in the harbour. So you can see there it's quite self-explanatory. It's got the date that the movement's going to occur, whether it's an arrival or a departure. So the arrival time, if it's an arrival, is actually the pilot boarding ground, which is 4 miles off Southhead, due east. That's where we board the vessels. And if it's a departure, it's the time the vessel will leave the berth. Something that's recently been added is the expected time at Bradley's Head as a guide, and that was done for recreational traffic so they can sort of see where the midpoint in the harbour is going to fall. Then it goes on and just says what the vessel name is, its type, and which port it's coming to or from, and which berth it's going to or from. So that's how that one works. And race committee, if you're already looking at it, that's great. That's one of the things we just try to insist that everyone in the committees have a look at this so they know when they're setting a course they can alert anyone sailing to what's going on. This next slide is probably quite prudent to you guys here at Middle Harbour. A lot of people think of this line coming into the harbour as a set of leads and will actually follow that line. Something that's quite peculiar. Sydney's one of the only ports where I've seen it. It is, I wouldn't say it's uncommon, but it's not regularly done. It actually isn't a set of leads for us, it's a traffic separation line. So inbound traffic we send to the north of that line and the outbound traffic to the south. So recently I had a vessel crossing me right off North Head, that crossed very close under my bow, and when questioned, the skipper of that vessel said that he thought that I was trying to get back to the line of the leads, so the safest thing for him was to cross the bow, and in actual fact I was lined up proceeding inbound on the standard track. So just something to be aware of. The line of the leads isn't necessarily where the ship will be. Generally you'll find that the ship's inbound will be to the north of that line and the ship's coming outbound will remain in the south of it. So that's the exclusion zone there to the north that we generally ask for. There's the two leading lights, so one's just behind us here and the other one's out on Grotto Point. Sorry, let's go back. I think there's another. Yeah, so there's the leads there, as you know, the rear one's just up the hill here and the front one's down on Grotto Point. So if you're lined up on them, that's of course what you'd see. Front and the rear. That's the track that we'll actually attempt to follow when we're coming inbound. And what we look for is actually the front lead lined up with the right hand of the two tall buildings at Chatswood. And strange things that we're trying to look for, but seeing a bit of the beach there. If you can see the beach, you know you're not too close to North Head. If you can't see the beach, you're too close to North Head. And there's another one that we can't quite see, but the Gallons Bombora light. If you can't see that one, that means you're too far to the south. So that just gives us a little box to try and line up on when we come in. So there's the beach and the two leads. So they are quite a long way split. So that's just an important one for people to realise that we don't use those as leads, but as a separation line. This is a screenshot of the tracks that we have. When we go out on board, you notice the bag going up before when we go on board the ship. In that bag we've got an iPad and a couple of GPS antennas. So we're able to use those. It's called a pilot positioning unit. It's quite accurate GPS and rate of turn unit. And we have these tracks superimposed on them. So as you can see there, the northbound track, as we said before, it goes to the north, goes to the north of the safe watermark and north of Fort Denison. And then that one's the outbound track, so south of Fort Denison outbound, south of the Bradley's Head safe watermark, and passing to the south of the traffic separation line up at the entrance. We mentioned Botany Bay earlier, so this is actually just to give everyone a little bit of knowledge about what we're doing as pilots, but quite often in ports we're using channel markers and leading lights. So You can see the channel markers, the reds and the green there, coming into Port Botany. This is a fairly traditional setup. And there's also a set of leading lights which are right ahead of the vessel. And when you blow it up, that's what we're seeing there. So typically around the world, that's common for making a shipping fairway or channel. In Sydney Harbour, we don't tend to have these sets of lights everywhere. We're relying on, instead, transits of landmarks and shore lights, because there's a lot of them. We found that those particular lights aren't necessarily required. And the other thing that occurs is that we get a lot of complaints about lights shining into rich people's windows. So we're seeing less and less lights. The shot before I showed you of the pilot positioning unit, now that that stuff's all getting better, there's a big push to be removing navigation aids everywhere. And I wouldn't be surprised in 20 years' time to see some of these lights disappearing from the harbour. Some are heritage listed, and that's good for us if they're heritage listed, because we actually get to hang on to them. We love our lights. Traditionally, we would have done all this visually. Yep.
So if those lights are removed, what then?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. So traditionally we were trained, I was trained even here when I started to do it all visually, so without using any electronics at all. And as we're getting more and more reliant on the electronics, what it basically means is if we get to a point where the electronics aren't working, we would actually cease operations. Question comes, what do you do if you're halfway through and you have a problem? So that's the one that no one's really crossed too much yet. And we're certainly pushing to keep the nav aids, but the powers to be want to get rid of them because it's actually ridiculously expensive.
With the fear of removing the lights, is that an Australian thing or is it international?
Internationally, there's a push for it. Probably most of this stuff's actually driven from Northern Europe. The Scandinavians kind of pioneered a lot of this stuff, and a lot of the time they're operating in restricted visibility anyway. So the notion is, well, if you fold in, what difference does it make? You can't see it anyway. Of course, our argument is just that if we've got the option for doing it visually or by the electronics, having both is a far better way to run. Yeah. So
that picture you had of the Botany Channel, it looked very narrow. Is that unusually narrow, or I mean?
It's actually wide.
It's wide.
Yeah. So let's go back to it. It's actually, sorry, I'm digressing, but it's interesting because you guys are cruising sailors, so you're not just going through Sydney, but something that's quite peculiar to this channel is that the beacons you can see are actually right on the very edge of the dredge pocket of the channel. So this is one of the big container ships we do. So the biggest container ships we're doing in Port Botany now are up to 340 metres long. They carry 10,000 containers.
So is that one heading towards the airport?
Towards the airport.
So the lights at the airport, on the other side of the airport?
Yeah, so true.
And we were there this weekend.
Yeah, so due west heading inbound. Yeah, so you can see the lights. There's the rock wall there. And over in the top corner of the screen there, you can probably just make out some container cranes.
Yeah.
And that's the very edge of the runway you can see right ahead. Yeah. So with this channel, I've actually put the beacons right on the very edge of the dredge pocket. The distance across is from memory 240 metres. If you go to Newcastle, the dredge pocket's actually only 180 metres wide, but they're similar sized ships. But what they do is move the beacons out maybe 50 metres from the edge of the dredge pocket, so the lights look as far apart. And the reason for that's so that if the ship actually runs aground, they won't knock the beacons over, and they've only got to free the ship and have to worry about the beacons. We had one knocked over recently in Botany. I'll say recently, probably 2 years ago. It was the last stream you can see from an outbound ship, and the cost to replace it was over $500,000, so it's quite an expensive exercise. And that's not including delays that have been incurred from ships because you can't pass when they're trying to pile drive and so on. So yeah, in Sydney Harbour we have a few sort of transits that we tend to use in lieu of having those leading lights. So this is one of them that we use when we're making the turn. This is turning inbound around the seabuoy. You can see that's the seabuoy over here. The Navy still refer to it as a junction bell. I don't know what do you guys usually call it, seabuoy or junction bell?
It's junction boy on the chart, but AS200.
Yeah, it's junction. I think it still says junction bell, doesn't it? Yeah.
Junction
But the bell's been taken off anyway, so there's no bell anymore. So yeah, we just refer to it as the Sea Boy. So just for, if you do hear on the radio Sea Boy, that's what they're referring to. So as we turn around the Sea Boy into the West Channel, we actually try and line up on, that's the Obelisk Bay Green, the next one down from Middle Head Green. So Middle Head Green would be somewhere here. And the Centre Point Tower. And for anyone who loves their numbers, that's 237 degrees true. And so when I come around there, I look down at the gyro compass. When I see 237 and I'm aiming for that, I know that I'm roughly right on the terms I'm aiming at.
Excuse me, someone once told me that when you came to that Obelisk Bay, when there were two obelisks there and they line up, that's supposed to be where the ships line that up and make the turn. Is there any
So originally that's right. So you can see the twin obelisks. The twin obelisks, when they're in transit, they actually pass through the line of the Sea Boy. And what that delineates is the 10-metre contour off South Head. So when the ships were much smaller, when they came around the corner coming from the south, they'd make sure they crossed the line of the two obelisks in the Sea Boy before they turned left into the harbour, and that made sure they didn't hit the shoals off South Head. So yeah, that's right. Yeah. And that's 268 if I remember my maths right. Here's another good one that we use. This is coming outbound around Bradley's Head. So you can see the Shark Islands over here, and we call those a wedding cake beacons, that style of beacon. So that one lined up with the big pine tree on the top of the hill, the biggest pine tree you can see. When you're passing between Fort Denison and Garden Island, if you get that one on transit 085, you know that you're in the right bit of water and you're not going to hit anything at Garden Island or Fort Denison.
Can you tell me why all those wedding cakes are out of plumb? They never
Good question. What they're posing as a problem now, no one's allowed to touch them because they're all heritage listed. So as they start leaning over more and more, and I suspect that one day they're just going to go like that, and everyone will go, yes.
Well, it happened, didn't it? They rebuilt one of them that fell over.
We had some other ones that have been chopped down. Yeah.
So it's not protected?
No, not as far as I know. Yeah. And occasionally, it's a valid question, but we have these marks that we use that just get lost, and we've got to come up with new ones. But
And there's got Christmas lights in it and lights now. Bit cheaper than the others.
Would be, yeah. Here's another good one passing under the harbour bridge. If you're on the deep draft leads when we're taking a large tanker out from Gore Cove, we try and line up the turret at Fort Denison and the water tank up on the hill. So, another one. Those two. That was just to show you guys a bit of a reference on some of the stuff we use in Sydney. This one's probably a more prudent slide. This is the speed profiles of ships. So, generally speaking, we stick to these fairly religiously, no matter what size of ship we're doing. Unless there's a good reason to be outside of those speeds, that's what you'll see a large commercial ship doing. So, West Channel, 10 to 12 knots. The reason for that is essentially, if you go too slow up that West Channel, particularly in a decent southeasterly or a strong westerly, you can actually have a hell of a time staying in the channel. The ship has excessive leeway, so we tend to want to go a bit faster there. Yeah, Phil?
John, what speed do you lose steerage on the ships?
So that varies a lot depending on the type of ship and how deep it's loaded. Worst case scenario, those big tankers like the one we saw the person getting on board. If they're fully loaded, then the worst thing that you can actually do is try to turn as you're de-accelerating when you've got no force flow over the rudder. And you could actually lose steerage there as high as 7 or 8 knots. And that's what we try to do, a gradual slow down, so if we need to, we can actually go up on the engine to steer. For the, I'll show you some slides of a cruise ship, what the underbody of a cruise ship looks like. They also vary a lot depending on the manoeuvring systems. But the most manoeuvrable, you can actually steer quite comfortably right down to almost stop speed. Yeah. So you can see there, when we're coming inbound, we'll be doing 10 to 12 knots, and then Bradley's Head, I normally aim for a sort of 8 to 10 there, and then generally Fort Denison around 7 knots, and the Harbour Bridge, Harbour Bridge at 6 knots. And once we get to the western side of the harbour bridge, for anyone that ventures down that way, usually you'll find the ship speeds are down below 6 knots in that area of the harbour. We talked about before about the pilot vessel being out front. So it's not necessarily always a pilot vessel. We've got a couple of other vessels that we can use for it, and also we can use the RMS vessels if we're short or if we need extra assistance. So recently I did one of the cruise ships out on Australia Day, and this owner was out on the water on Australia Day, but everybody who had a boat was out there, and so we actually needed to have 2 or 3 escort vessels depending on the time of day to keep everyone out of the way and safe. So essentially, the escort vessel will sit at a distance ahead of the ship. 500 metres is what's nominated in all the requirements. And there's times where we might ask as the pilot for them to move further ahead just to confirm with somebody that they've seen us, or occasionally we see people anchored in the channel, which is obviously a reason for them to go ahead. Or if we suspect somebody's broken down and they need assistance, we try and send them ahead. So that can occur. Because we do also have a lot of other vessels on the harbour that are doing work at times, we generally ask the escort vessel to put the red and blue flashing lights on. So sometimes you'll notice them going along with them off, and then if all of a sudden the traffic density gets such that we want them to sort of start actively moving people out of the way, they'll turn their flashing lights on. At night time, these cause a hell of an issue with visibility, because you just can't see anything other than the disco in front of you. So we generally get them to turn them off at night unless they're needed to tell somebody to move out of the way. In general, it's just common sense. If you see a patrol vessel, whether it be an RMS or a Port Authority vessel in front of a ship, obviously there's a fairly good chance they're going to be escorting, and the safest thing is just not to pass between the ship and that vessel to move out of the way. So that's an example of Miller's Point. It's one of our other escort vessels. It's not a pilot boat, but you can see up the top she is actually equipped with the red and blue flashes. And we're just about to take delivery of 2 new patrol vessels, which are bigger than this one again and form dual purpose for firefighting and pollution prevention. And so you'll occasionally see those performing escort duties as well. Most of you would have probably seen these posters that are readily available, but that just says what we talked about. So the Steer Clear campaign, it's got the escort vessel out in front of the ship, 500 metres in front, and then we also request that vessels remain 30 metres clear of each side and 30 metres clear of the transom. One of the things that some people don't factor is that these ships, when they're moving ahead, the pivot point of the vessel is about 1/3 of the way back from the bow of the ship. So when they do alter course, the stern does close quite quickly. So if you do get too close down the side of the ship, you can actually be at risk as well of having an issue with the vessel. There's also interaction issues with the ship's propeller and so on turning that will affect your yacht. So yeah, that's why we ask for 30 metres clearance. On those posters, there's a bit about the VHF channels. I'll talk about those a little bit later on as well. Just back to that vessel movements, we've discussed it already, but that one's a little bit, shows a few other movements. You've got arrivals and departures. So just so everyone can see how to read that. This one here, the first one is an arrival of a ship called the Alandra Sea, chemical tanker, and she's going to go to Gore Cove. So the time the pilot would board the vessel is 11 o'clock, and that'd be at Bradley's Head approximately 11:55. The second one, Gore Cove 2, so that'll be FBA2, that's actually just a small fuel barge, so I'll probably go to the next one down, which is the Mariba. So that's a large bulk carrier. She's coming out of Glebe Island, departing, and she's going to be leaving Glebe Island at 3 o'clock, so she'll be at Bradley's Head at 4:05. So that's the way to read that shipping schedule. A bit of background to how this is developed real time is that we have vessel traffic services that are actually sitting down in Botany Bay. They do Sydney Harbour as basically the same as an air traffic control for commercial vessels in Sydney Harbour, but they're doing it remotely. So they have a series of cameras throughout the harbour, radar scanners, and they've also got the AIS on every vessel as well that they're watching. So when you hear the radio operator calling up at Sydney Harbour, it's actually somebody sitting in an office down at Port Botany who's doing it and watching it all on computer screens. I tend to joke with them that maybe the next step will be someone sitting in Bangladesh doing the same job. Let nothing go down too well. Years gone by, some of you may recall the control tower that was down at where Barangaroo is now. So since I've worked here, that hasn't been in operation, but everybody, whether it be a pilot on the water or the VTS operators, say that was far better because they could actually look out the window and see what was happening. They had a much better situational awareness. Of course, Mr. Packer had better plans for the area and more money, so that was into that. So it is worth just bearing that in mind. The person who's talking, if you do end up talking to somebody on Channel 13 for Vessel Traffic Services, they actually are down in Botany Bay, not seeing in real time in Sydney Harbour. But essentially they're taking ship bookings from an agent. So a shipping agent gets a call from the captain of the ship or the terminal and says, we think we're going to be finished cargo at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the ship will be right to sail at 2 o'clock. So then they go onto there's a database and they just nominate the time, and then after everybody's accepted the time, so that's the vessel traffic services saying yes, it can go at that time. Us as the pilots will accept the vessel, the tow company accepts the vessel, and also the lines company. That's when it appears here. So these ones are kind of your locked in shipping schedule times. But as you recall at the start, I talked about the cruise ship rule, and that's an example of where you won't see a shipping time come up for a vessel. So you can still have a ship moving, but there's not a nominated time for it. So it is worth just bearing that in mind.
But you said you were going to talk about the channels, but an unauthorised ship movement will be on Channel 13, for example.
Yeah, that's right. So for Sydney Harbour it's Channel 13, and for Botany Bay, when you go down there, it's Channel 12. So the port limits actually extend a 4-mile radius from South Head for Sydney Harbour and from Henry Head in Botany. So basically quite a long way out to sea, 3 or 4 miles out to sea, Channel 13 and then Channel 12 in Botany. So I'll just next slide there, talk a little bit about what their objectives are, and then I'll also talk a bit about an unscheduled movement and how that would be communicated to everyone. So vessel traffic services, this is now an IMO requirement around the world. This exists for anyone who goes off and cruises elsewhere would know that for sure. And they do operate to different levels. I can't rattle off from the top of my head what they are, but they basically provide different levels of service from a simple information service where they'll just say this is what's occurring in the area and give weather information, right through to actually having someone like myself, a pilot, directing the vessel directly, telling them what to do remotely. So there are various levels of it. So here in Sydney, the VTS is certified through AMSA, so they have got international accreditation as a vessel traffic service. There's usually 2 operators, one for Botany, one for Sydney Harbour, so they're independently operating, and then we have one person, the supervisor, who's overseeing both of those ports. So there's 3 people who are sitting up in the office in Botany doing this. So basically they're to aid the mariners in safe and efficient use of navigable waters within the VTS area, communicate information about the onboard decision-making processes for ships and commercial vessels. They generally won't have much to do with recreational vessels. They try to minimise that because otherwise it would just go crazy. The next one is where we sort of slip into this level is assisting providing a harmonious interface between recreational and commercial shipping. So ultimately, where there's planned events, as most yacht clubs are dealing with, then that can be of assistance to be in contact with VTS. And lastly, and this is probably their most important role, is if there is an incident in the harbour, whether it be a safety or pollution incident, or for that matter, even some sort of terrorist event or something as heinous as that, they will actually get involved in being the first port of call for the emergency response. So they do broadcast information on a regular basis. It's probably not a bad move if you're just stooging around the harbour to have Channel 13 switched on. Dual watch on 13/16 is a really good option. And then if you're down in Botany Bay, dual watch on 12 and 16 is a good option as well. Every second hour in each port, you can see the times there. They do odd hours in Sydney, even hours in Botany. They give the expected shipping movements, so that's actually more up to date than the one we saw on the website because it's the real-time movements. They also give, we've got a series of weather gauges throughout both ports. Some of you may be familiar with that. There's a wave, wind and tide page which shows the offshore swell, height and direction, tide times and so on. So they'll give that information on channel 12 and 13, and if anyone's got any concerns at that time, it's a bit like the call in with your PMRs. There's actually a space for you to speak to them afterwards once I've done those 2 calls. When we're going in and out on the large vessels in Sydney Harbour, we actually have a series of reporting points that we'll verbally say over the radio, just so that everyone who's participating on channel 13 can hear. So the first one's what we call Line Zulu. So that's between the Hornby Light on South Head and North Head Light. Then we've got the Seaboy as our next reporting point, Bradley's Head, and Fort Denison. So you'll hear ships calling up saying they're passing one of those marks inbound or outbound as they go. So this is what we were talking about before when there's the deviation. Sometimes there's examples of ships where they can't meet the time that they were scheduled to sail on the website. So an example of that would be mechanical issues or cargo operations not complete, and we may delay or cancel the sailing time. Generally, under the Marine Safety Act, we actually have to give a ship 1 hour. So if I attend a ship that's departing at 1500, say, I'm legally not allowed to leave until 1600. That's what I can say, right? We're not ready, I'm going. So there could be a significant delay to a ship departing, or for that matter, arriving. The second reason that it might occur is because we're relying on 2 different tow companies in Sydney. Engage is one and Spitz is the other one, and one lines company. And sometimes they're unable to provide us the right tugs or linesmen for the job, so that can cause a delay. And then there's also possibilities of deviations from the conventional route. So, as I said before, we may use the East Channel, or we might go against the flow of traffic separation. That's been going north of Port Denison or north of Bradley's Head, so Watermark. And occasionally that does occur. And once again, if in doubt, listen to Channel 13, and that all gets conveyed regularly on Channel 13. So this is just an example of some different routes that might be taken by a ship. So coming inbound, fairly standard here, going down the West Channel. There's the East Channel, and then that's the typical outbound route south of Bradley's Head. And then this one is an alternative where we might go north of the Bradley's Head, say from Lamar. Similarly at Fort Denison, we often have ships passing north and south there at the same time. And occasionally we'll go in the opposite direction depending. There's usually got to be a good reason for this. It's not something we do, but once again it can happen, just be aware of it, I guess. The warning on the back of a truck. Can't see the mirrors, so I can't see you. Pretty much the same problem on ships. This is a good one. There's some crazy stuff that goes on with bridge visibility.
Why wouldn't they put cameras in the bow?
Some ships do, cruise ships mostly do. A lot of ships that have problems there also put a small radar unit on the bow, but basically the reason they don't is, once again, ship owners have got to be the tightest people you'll ever come across, and they won't spend a buck if they don't have to. So they actually try and exploit the IMO requirements for visibility, the international requirements. So you can see here, it actually says on the pilot code for this one, it's a bit hard to read, 451 metres. So from the bridge position, the conning position of the ship, once something's closer than 450 metres to the bow, we can't actually see it from the bridge of the ship, which is crazy. But that's not the minimum. The minimum is actually 500 metres. And 500 metres only with 10 degrees either side of the bow. So I've actually been on a couple of container ships where on the very size of that front tier of containers, they've actually put 2 or 3 extra high, blocking it totally because they say you've got your 10 degrees and so we can fit an extra 4 containers on, so you can't see. So that's the level that unfortunately we have to deal with visibility.
So is it the pilot that steers the boat, or you just advise them the captain?
Yeah, so typically I'll go on board, so for an inbound ship, I'll give the captain a briefing of what we're going to do, and then we have what we call the conduct of the ship, or the con of the ship. So He's directing. There's a person steering the helmsman, and there's somebody on the engine telegraph. And at that point, the captain will say to me, "All right, you take the con of the ship," and I'll say, "Okay, I've got the con," and I'll repeat the course that we're steering, and then basically it's my ship then, so I'm taking control of the vessel. So
But you're not actually helming, it's someone else.
no, someone else helms. So I'll tell the helmsman, I'll either give him a course to steer, I'll give him a rudder angle that I want him to put on, or sometimes I'll actually give him a rate of turn in degrees per minute that I want him to steer to make a constant radius turn. So we've got a few options there.
Do you also control the tugs?
Yeah, so we're a radio to the tugs. So when we get the tugs coming alongside, they'll talk to me, they don't talk to the captain.
Right, so you just on one end and a nudge here or all there or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, effectively we take the control of the ship from the captain. So yeah.
The VHF you used to speak to the channel, you used to speak to the tugs.
Yeah.
Is that 13 as well?
No. So we've got actually got 2 working channels for Sydney and 2 for Botany that are separate. So channel 13 we just leave for our initial call. So usually you'll hear when the ship's coming inbound, they'll be given a working channel by VTS, and the working channel we'll use for the pilot boat as an escort vessel and also for the tugs that are coming along. So we try and keep that off channel 13 because there's too much traffic on channel 13.
So if the ship runs aground while you're in control, how is that working from an insurance perspective?
It's an interesting one.
Yeah.
So legally, it's quite strange. So the captain's got to give me the control of his ship,
Yeah.
but if I crash it, it's his problem.
Okay.
If you perform something, an act of gross negligence, that's a bit different. So if you're out there drunk or even fatigued enough, if you know you haven't slept properly and you've gone to work and decided to go piloting and you crash, you'll probably land up in jail. If it's a legitimate mistake, or quite often it's a mechanical failure, then there's a reliance on, there's quite a few different factors. So the captain's supposed to be watching everything that I do and make sure the orders that I'm giving are reasonable and appropriate for the conditions. And if he thinks I'm not, he's supposed to ask for clarification, or if need be, take the control of the ship back over from you. Yeah, so that's how that would work. Yeah, so I guess in answer it's no, I won't go to jail, they will, but I won't be getting a promotion.
So as the pilot, are you always in the cockpit?
Yeah, so
Or on the bridge?
on the bridge, yeah. So remember on the first slide we saw the pilot go onto the bridge. So once I'm up there, I stay there and we'll con the vessel from that position. And the only difference to that is when we're actually coming alongside the wharf, we'll go right out to the bridge wing. And there's usually anything from a fairly basic set of repeaters for all of the equipment out there that I can just see what's happening, and the rest is conveyed by radio, or right up to a cruise ship that's got full control, so they move all the controls to the bridge wing and then you can see alongside of the wharf as you're coming alongside. Yep. So we'll stay there until the ship's all fast, and then that's when we leave after that. Yep. So this is a typical tanker we take into Gore Bay. So these ships, you can see there, it's 250 metres long. This one's not fully loaded. You can see the anti-foul line, the red line there. So if she's fully loaded, that would be roughly where the ship would be loaded to. So she's got quite a long way to go, that one. So typically that would be around 8 or 9 metres in draft. And if we were bringing them into Sydney Harbour fully loaded, the deepest we can go to is around 13 metres draft. So at this particular draft, this one was displacing just under 60,000 tonnes, and the bow visibility there is actually quite good at 200 metres, so we can see things 200 metres away, which for our trips that we're normally doing is actually quite close. Someone mentioned they met Michael before. That's the back of his head. So this is what we see coming inbound to Gore Cove with the tanker. So you can see there he's just basically heading down to Stores Point before he makes a right-hand turn to pass under the harbour bridge. So that's we were talking about the conning position before. So that's where we'd be standing on the ship. So this guy here's the helmsman. So he's got it's a bit hard to see, but on that console there's the steering wheel, and he's got a compass repeater in front of him. The pilot's standing in front of one of the radar units, you can see there. He'd also have his iPad in front of him with the electronic chart going. And on the other side, there'd be another officer who's got the engine telegraph to control the speed. Yep. side. So
Oh, that's the front of the page, sorry.
yeah, that's the front there. So you can see the South Island, the bridge, and the Opera House.
Yeah.
Yep.
Is,
There's water in cement.
is Navionics the choice for charge
It's
software?
not.
It's not.
Yeah, so basically we are using a system that works on electronic, a proper ENC, so they call an S57 or S63 chart, which basically means that in actual fact, Sydney Harbour, we've gone to something called an S102 chart now, so they all relate to the level of accuracy of the soundings. Navionics is an interesting one. So what they do is basically rip off those charts. So for the most part, they're very good. Has anyone had experience where you've been in places where it's not quite right with Navionics? Yeah. There's a few bits up across harbour that are a bit sus. So the way it kicked off, they actually were giving fishermen free plotters, getting them to go out, and then they were downloading where they'd been versus what the depths they were getting from their sounder. And there's also a function on there where you could switch over to sounding contours, and they were actually just a line of best fit. So there was an 11 metre depth here and 11 metre there. We put a straight line between the two, but there might be a 2 metre one in between. So with Navionics, I would just be a little bit cautious of being too reliant on Navionics. It's not bad. I actually had it on my phone when I go offshore yacht racing. I've had to do it a few times. You know, you lose the electronics on the boat. It's a great backup to press the button and you've got something in front of you, but there's certainly no substitute for a proper gazetted electronic chart. Yeah.
But you can't get that as a private person, or is it?
Yeah, you can. Just
Okay.
have to pay the money. Yeah. Cost of it, the problem, so I'm saying all this, so when I do my yacht racing navigation, I actually use CMAP charts. The reason is you pay for CMAP once and you've got it for life. If you want to use electronic charts, I would usually use Expedition, the program, for doing all the navigation. And you have to pay the licensing fee each year, so it's around $400 every year to keep an Australian folio of electronic charts going. Whereas, yeah, you CMAP, you pay once, but you get what you get, and you don't get any updates.
Yeah.
So. That's another example of a tanker in a slightly different ballast condition. You can see heading inbound from a similar location. When we go out to that bridge wing composition where we're coming alongside, this is the sort of view you would see then. So you can see the reason that those two shots are taken back to back. From the middle, that's the perspective. From the ship side, that's the perspective. So they're quite different. It looks like one's going to be running straight into the house of the famous people there who seem to change regularly, and the other one's going to be going all right. So yeah, so we're sort of very conscious of that when we're moving around the ship. And one of the first things we learn as a pilot is before you make any decisions on collision avoidance, get yourself right in the middle and have a look down before you start giving any orders. And you can see there, that's one of our tugs. So the tug, that particular tug there is quite a good one. One of the Damon tugs, which someone mentioned before, they saw the tugs that were registered in Newcastle. So that's one of the ones that came from Newcastle. And they're around about they can go up to 70 tonnes of bollard pull on their line. So if we ask for full power, they can achieve 70 tonnes on their line, which is quite impressive.
Are the blue ones a different tug company or what?
Yeah, so they're Engage, which is the competitors. Similar sort of tugs, yeah, but buying for the cheapest prices. This one's an interesting one. So at Glebe Island, we're doing a lot of cement ships. Obviously, with all the construction in Sydney, we have to bring a lot of glue, metal and cement into the harbour. So these are self-discharging ships. And why we've got this slide is just to show how sometimes our visibility is so hampered by the ship type. You can see there that we lose visibility quite a lot. So when we're piloting one of these ships, we're quite reliant on having a ship's crew being a lookout at the bow, from our pilot boat out in front telling us what's around, and also the guys that are up on the bridge with us getting usually one of those to go either side to keep a lookout as well. That's another example of a self-discharge, so just another one we have. But you can see from the centre line of the ship there, you really have virtually no visibility. It's just blocked out by all the gear. Now everyone's favourite cruise ships. So this one's coming out of White Bay. Because you're so far forward on these, the visibility down in front of you is actually quite good. The problem is looking back. It's actually quite unnerving when you look back. And I struggled a lot when I started in Gladstone. All the ships were aft accommodation, and coming here to Sydney, I had to try and train myself to start dealing with standing at the front, looking back. And when you turn a corner on one of these things, it actually looks quite drastic how fast the stern swings away. So before we turn, we actually have somebody looking astern either side of the ship, and most of them actually have cameras as well. And you can see if someone's parked themselves too close to where the stern is before you turn.
So sorry, on a ship like that, how many people would have on board during visuals?
On the bridge team, you mean, working with me? Or?
So as a pilot,
Yeah.
how many people would you have positioned across that type of ship?
Yeah.
To give you visuals back?
So when we're coming and going from port, on the minimum bridge manning we have, which is what you'll get on a tanker or a bulk carrier, is myself, the captain, the helmsman, an officer, and that's it on the bridge. So only 4 of us. And then usually you'll have somebody forward and somebody down aft, so another 2 guys. Ship's crew, yeah. Yep. So, and often they're talking in whatever, Burmese, Chinese, you've got no idea what they're saying. So a lot of the job is about trying to pick up body language. You can hear, the raised voices or anything like that about what's going on. So, and quite often there's multiple nationalities on the ship too, which causes another problem. So that's the bare minimum we get. Cruise ships, they take it up a notch. There's obviously more people on board, and the crews are bigger. So generally there, we'll probably have about 8 people on the bridge of the ship, and then we'll have officers forward and aft as well. And generally find with them they're a lot more proactive because
You also work with Navy vessels or just commercial?
only if the Navy, in Sydney they've got their own pilots, so they'll do, Australian naval vessels are exempt from pilotage for all Australian ports. They'll do the foreign ships mainly here, but occasionally they'll ask us to do one if they can't, or it's usually if it's a more difficult job, they call a merchant pilot. When I was in Gladstone, we would do all US ones and so on, the Chinese, Japanese ones. I've done, in Sydney, I've only done Japanese ship twice, and that was actually interesting because there was only one person who could speak English, so it was literally me telling them in English, translation to them, translation back, and then I'd get the order back. So, yeah. So we talked about that perspective from the bridge. This one's just a good little slide to show us. This is in Port Botany again. So this was taken from the VGS camera. You can see the outrigger canoe and the ship. Looks like there's a hell of a distance between the two. This is what the pilot could see. If anyone can see it out there, you can pick the outrigger. Just see it, I think. So there it is there. So it looks like you're actually passing quite close to it. And then similarly, this one just shows the same thing but on a larger container ship. So you can see the beacons there and the pilot boat. So that's pilot boat's around about 500 metres away from the ship. And then similarly, this small boat crossing would actually probably be crossing clear ahead, but from the ship's perspective, you can't see those things. The reason we just want everyone to be aware of this is often once something disappears under our bow, we have to take some form of action, which might be as drastic as running the ship aground. And it might just be somebody going, have a look at the big ship, how cool is that? So we just sort of do ask that everyone, I know you guys have expressed already, you're aware of it, but not passing between the pilot boat and the ship is a really big plus for us if we can have that one. Although this one's an interesting one. I don't know if anyone can see the problems there. When you look at it like that, it all looks pretty good. Soon again, there's actually 3 kayakers. Yeah. And this is the next shot. See the pilot boat racing back, and there they are just there. So they just actually kept paddling straight under the bow of the ship. So fortunately this ship was departing the anchorage at the time, so she was only going quite slowly, but the pilot ended up having to take evasive action, and these people were seemingly unaware of it, and they were paddling into danger.
That's Chowder Bay, is it?
Yeah, it's Chowder Bay right ahead. So this is departing the anchorage in the middle of Nielsen Park there.
We call them speed humps, but you would make the film.
Just a quick chat now about the cruise ships. So already this year we've had 250 separate visits by cruise ships, generally going to Sydney Cove and White Bay. Occasionally they're using the anchorages off the Zoo and Point Piper. Usually they're very good with their timings. They've got a set schedule and they want to comply with them. One of the problems we have is at Sydney Cove, because of the ferry traffic, we actually shut Sydney Cove between 6:45 and 9:30 and 4:30 and 6:45 weeknights to commercial traffic moving. So that allows the ferries to have free reign. So occasionally on the departure, which is usually the afternoon, if they miss the 16:30 sailing time, they get put right back to 18:45. So that's just something to be aware of once again with that shipping schedule. Coming into winter now, cruise ships drop off. We generally don't have as many, but we'll have 3 or 4 regulars that keep coming. And then around about October, we'll see them all coming back in full swing again. So this is one of the largest ones we do, the Quantum class. You can see they're 347 metres long and massive amounts of power. So they take about 4,000 passengers and 2,000 crew on board.
Pods are what a, oh, like that.
Yeah, so this isn't actually, this is another near sister ship to that one, but this one's a little bit different again. So most of them just have the 2 pods, one either side, and they're pulling pods, so they actually, the propellers pull the water through the pod. So they can go through 360 degrees to control the stern of the vessel. And this particular one has what they call a fixed pod in the middle, so that's just basically a headless stern, the fixed pod, but most of them don't have that. Excuse me. So they're capable of putting out enormous, inordinate amounts of power. It's quite scary actually. To the extent we're in Sydney Cove, we're having problems because they're actually blasting the wharf wings away and slowly the wharf subsiding. There's the bow thrusters. See that person standing there? Yeah, so you can imagine what happens when you wind up at full power. It's quite scary, the amount of wash that it creates. So each one of those has got about the power of that tug I showed you before with the 70 tonnes pull. You've got 4 of those lined up on the bow of the ship. One of the issues we have with big ships is, of course, the windage. These set of slides just show what happens when we get wind on the beam. So once we get wind on the beam of the ship, we have to start allowing for leeway, otherwise we're going to end up running out of the channel, as you can see there. And so we end up quite commonly going down the west channel at a bit of an angle, like you can see. Why that's important is because at 7 degrees leeway, which isn't really a hell of a lot, instead of being 40 metres wide, we're now 83 metres wide, so we've virtually doubled the beam of the ship by virtue of the leeway. And the problem there is that we can't slow down. Once we're in that position, it's got to keep the speed up, otherwise the leeway just gets worse and worse.
Who makes the decision close to the harbour for inclement weather, and what's the protocol?
Yeah, generally it will be, so we keep a duty pilot on station the whole time. As far as commercial shipping goes, we'll generally make the decision, and that'll be in consultation with the harbour master at the time. A lot of it here is dictated by the sea state outside. Often it's too rough to board once the wind's up anyway. Typically, for these cruise ships, probably up to 30 knots of wind we can still operate in, depending on how many tugs we've got available. Most of them can actually handle 20 knots without a tug, but we still have a tug in reserve just in case.
Sorry, do you mentioned that the sea state and the conditions and when you board, but do you actually exit at the same point?
Yeah, so we've got to get off. Last year I got a free trip to Melbourne. Yeah, it's difficult. Getting off's actually harder than getting on. Yeah, so typically, what you've probably noticed a few times, in summer it's not too bad with the northeasterly because generally it's a short chop, and so it's quite easy to make a little bit of a turn to the south and you get a nice lee on the side of the ship. In the big southerly swells where we find it difficult, and usually we'll try and disembark with quite a sharp turn on the ship, and what tends to happen there is you end up, as the ship turns, its weight peels away nicely and there's a nice little glassy patch, and you usually get about 30 seconds where that occurs, and you can just get the boat in and get off in that time.
Do you check it?
No.
Not at all.
No. So we come down on the ladder, and then we've got a set of man ropes on the side. Now we've got 2 female pilots. I guess we have to call them person ropes, but just hang on, and you actually sort of bungee off the ship's side and try and come down. Yeah, they have tried to come up with different ways of doing it, but that's the best that the traditional way so far has been the safest that anyone's come up with. Yeah. That was leeway to the crash stop. This one's just from the ship's manoeuvring data at 23 knots, so we're not going to be going that fast in Sydney Harbour, but you can see it still takes 1,600 metres to stop there, which is 5 minutes, so it's quite a slow process to stop. With the cruise ships, what tends to happen is they don't just run the engine astern like a traditional vessel where you go full astern. They do something called a transverse arrest, where you saw those azipods before. They actually turn them out to the side, and when they do that, the amount of wash that causes is like a big parachute that sucks onto the ship, and it actually slows the ship's way quite quickly. The reason I'm showing this slide is just to be aware that if that does occur, there's going to be a hell of a lot of wash out the sides of the vessel, and it's pretty extreme, the amount of weight that they create when that occurs. The other thing that tends to happen is that they lose directional stability when that's occurring, so it's not uncommon to see the ship do a few wobbles as that occurs.
Do you have to do crash stops very often in the harbour?
No, just trying to think. For me, I mean, in 10 years I might have done 1 or 2 maybe. Yeah, it's enough to get your heart going, I can tell you that. And once again, the one time that I recall doing it, literally was just somebody, oh, look at the big ship, and then they just motor off, and you've just nearly run aground and been going crazy on the engines and the tow, but they're all oblivious to it because the distances are so far, it doesn't look extreme to them. Yeah. Coming inbound, this one's just a quick one to show often what will happen. You're all aware of the East Coast current. If you get those good East Coast current conditions that we sometimes get, we can be encountering sort of 8 or 9 degrees of leeway coming in, and that's our pilot positioning here. It's a little bit hard to see. You can see the ship's doing 8.7 knots ahead and nearly 3 knots sideways. So the direction the ship's going versus the heading of the ship are quite different. This one's probably a little bit more interesting to look at. So we do simulation runs. We go down to Tasmania, and they've got a ship simulator there with the exact models of the ships we're doing and the exact hydrodynamic model report. And we do all of our contingency training there, where we practice crashing, crash stops, turns, and so on. So this one's just to show you what it would take for a loaded tanker to come to a stop. So you can see 120,000 odd tonnes with 3 tugs. If you tried to stop the ship from the end of the West Channel, minute 18 here, you're only doing 7 knots, which is relatively slow anyway. It actually takes 6 minutes to get it down to 3 knots. So, and in that time, you're starting to struggle to steer the ship because you're losing your flow over the rudder at that time. So that's why we're sort of particular with the large tankers. They're quite stressful as far as stopping in a hurry.
Do you get a feel at all for what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Are you holding a helm on the back?
Yep.
You do?
Yeah. So probably most of the guys and ladies I work with have done some small boating. That's what's got them interested in it. Some haven't, but yeah, most people do get a good feel for what's happening.
Are these sort of ships set up, like if all else fails and you manoeuvre suddenly say, right, we need to get down quick, are they set up so that you can just say, right, drop it?
So when we come in, we actually ask them, so they have a couple of securing mechanisms on the ship's anchor and a cover over the hawse pipe, which is the one that goes out to the ocean, and the spurling pipe, which goes to the chain locker. So we ask for all that to be removed, and somebody standing by. Touch wood, I haven't had to let one go in anger, but people who have, it's really very uncontrolled and incredibly dangerous. If you're at speed, I would say that probably more than 4 knots speed, you wouldn't have a hope in hell of actually the brake holding. The chain will just slip through. And if you want to have some interesting YouTube footage, go and Google that, because there's some great footage of it where with anchor winches on fire, and at the end there's something called the bitter end, which just comes out, and that generally decapitates somebody all the way through. So it's really, yes, we have it as it's more if you've stopped the vessel, you'll deploy the anchor. Yeah, sorry.
John, if you towards the harbour bridge and drop the anchor, what else would happen?
Yeah, so there's something else in the way down there, the tunnel, which isn't actually a tunnel. And most of you will probably be aware that the tunnel goes across basically from the Opera House across to Wilson's Point. And it's actually just a series of caissons joined together that are only held by water pressure. There's not actually a physical fastener on that thing. Next time you drive under it, it's just 2 bits of concrete with a little bit of insertion rubber in the middle. They put them all down there and then they pump the water out and then there's a tunnel. So, and then they covered it with some rock armour. Theoretically, it can withstand an anchor being dropped on top of it from a tanker this size, which was the largest ship at the time we had coming in. But stays on it suggests that if you ground the ship on top of the tunnel, you'll actually breach it. So it's a no anchoring zone there. We don't want to test dragging an anchor across it just in case that's not the case. And you can imagine with no mechanical fasteners, the tunnel will just peel open. So I'll touch wood again. Sorry, no, it's just showing the time. So, just think of that one is 6 minutes to lose 4 knots is pretty slow going. All right, we're coming to the end of it, guys. I've just got a couple of slides with some videos of what it looks like to us when we're a reasonably busy day and we've got a few interesting situations. So, this one's a products tanker, about 180 metres going inbound to Gore Cove. It's all sped up, so you can see here coming up to Bradley's Head, and you can see this one guy on his yacht that just doesn't want to stop. So the wake there is a pilot boat actually circling back to get him out of the way.
He's on starboard tack.
That's the sort of thing that happens. So continue on, and now we've got another one to deal with, so they just sort of keep coming on the day like that. And there's the escort vessel finally catching up. Okay, that was the end of the presentation. Now we've got any questions.
John, you touched on tugs and pilots at the boat. I'm just thinking, sitting at Circular Quay having dinner and watching the cruise ship go out, and they do that spin turn between the bridge and the Opera House.
Yes.
You've got at least one tug, sometimes two.
That's right, yeah.
You've got all those thrusters you just talked about. You've got the pilot, you've got the crew. First of all, what's the sort of command structure, and then what's the process? I mean, how's that actually choreographed? How's the choreography work?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So on a cruise ship, as I said, they've got a bigger bridge team. So generally there you'll have the hierarchy of the ship. There'll be the captain and the staff captain, or the deputy captain as they call them. It's basically like a 2IC. And then usually a first officer, and then 2 junior officers, a helmsman, and probably 3 to 4 lookouts. So on the bridge of a cruise ship, you've got about 8 cruise ship staff, ranking from the captain at the very top, and his immediate second in command. They'll usually nominate one of those 2 to actually be on the controls of the cruise ship, and then we come on board and prior to the departure we'll have a briefing, and we'll discuss with them what the manoeuvre is going to be, so what heading we're going to come out on. And they've got excellent electronics on board as well.
Would the tug captain be in on that briefing?
Yeah, so we do that by radio. And so when we do, I showed you before the shot from the simulation, it's actually quite cool. When we go and do the simulations at the ship simulator, there's actually 2 attached tug simulators. So there'll be one of the tug captains will come along with us, and they'll be sitting there in the room next door, driving the tug for us doing the ship manoeuvre at the same time. So we essentially learned all that in our training. So, for example, for that manoeuvre you talked about, it's a fairly standard one, and so we'll just say to them, make fast. Usually it's the same spot. If we have one tug, it'll be the centre lead aft, we call it, right down the middle at the back. And they know what to expect as far as the manoeuvre goes. If there's something untoward, we'll just explain to them what's going to occur so they can preempt a little bit what's going to occur. So yeah, generally in that situation, because of the manoeuvring gear on the cruise ship, it's impractical for me to be giving direct orders to the ship staff because they've got their thrusters and pods. And you could imagine with that much horsepower, just moving it 5% makes a massive difference. So usually in that situation, I'll just monitor their speed and their heading and their lateral position, and I'll say, okay, I think you need to move further to port, and then watch what they do with the pods and the thruster and make sure they're doing the right thing. And if need be, I'll position the tug to assist with that.
So once the tug is attached, does it stay attached to that point?
We can, for that particular part of it, it does. We can let them go and move them. Sometimes we'll put them, in different positions depending on. So Gorko is a classic one with the tankers. Will come inbound and we might have the tug pushing on one side, and then after they finish doing that, they'll come around and push on the other side and put their line up. But generally for circular key, they'll put their line in the one spot and leave it. So that's how that works. And then, as I said, their electronics are excellent. And one of the problems I have with the cruise ships, they do it all by electronics. They don't like looking out the window. On their electronics, they've got something called a ship predictor, and if anyone's interested, I've actually got my iPad here with a few replays, and I can show you what that looks like later on. And so they're just watching that, and it actually shows you if you continue doing what you're doing, this is where your ship's going to end up in 180 seconds. And so they'll just keep adjusting to make sure we get right in the middle of the swinging circle, and that's why it always looks quite nice there, because the ships always end up in the same spot, right in the middle between Wilson's Point and the Opera House, and we always try to spin at the same location.
Good.
Yep.
Very much. Thank you very much for.